Thanks for stopping in, everybody. Lauren Phillips with the Dairy Farmers of America, and Jay Dingra with Khoj, our integration partner. So we're going to talk a little bit today about our transformation from hosted IT operation into the Microsoft Azure cloud. All right, take it away. So Dairy Farmers of America, kind of a unique business model. We're a Farmers Cooperative, so we are owned by the farmers, or what we like to call the producers. There's 14,500 member farms throughout the United States. We produce $14.5 billion of milk annually, so quite a massive operation. We have 8,000 members, or member farms, 14,000 members, and we have quite diversified portfolio: milk, ice cream, yogurt, cheese, all kinds of things like that, as well as a lot of ingredients that you'll recognize in some of your chips and snack products and different things like that. So fourth largest global cooperative in the world. So one of our issues, they cut my favorite slide, which was our mission statement, is to deliver value to our farmers. And one area where we were not delivering value at all was through our IT infrastructure. And the problem is we had too many data centers. So we started out with 18 data centers, and if you listen to the presentation this morning, SAP is running their cloud operations on 17 data centers, hosting 10,000 customers and so forth. And we have more data centers than what SAP does, right? So it just didn't work. It's complex. Every one of these operations, you've got network connectivity, you've got all this expense, you got management to keep track of it all. So we've grown by consolidation. So each acquisition you make, usually you get 2 data centers, if they're in an on-prem model, so you get the production and then you get disaster recovery, and so they multiply very quickly. We also had some management decisions in the past by previous leadership where they just kept adding additional data centers, and it just wasn't a very cost-effective way. So our business solution was to insource our staff and migrate out of hosted data center models into the Azure cloud. Now you say insourcing your staff, why would you want to do that? The trend over the past several years, which I think is now outdated, is to move to an outsourced hosted model, and you just put it all away. We found that was very inflexible for us. It was stifling innovation, and it certainly wasn't cost effective. So we had this massive, for us, ecosystem. Most of you know SAP. You don't have just your SAP system. You have bolt-ons and all these other things. And how do you move it? Well, the same way you might move your house or your apartment, you put it into boxes and you haul it out of the house one box at a time. And in essence, that's what we did. As we did that, we used an agile approach, which Jay will be talking about in a little bit. But in the traditional ways, or I'll say in the old days, you'd go through this tremendous waterfall implementation plan. You'd have detailed steps, thousands of lines. You'd rehearse it with, several times with dress rehearsals, and you'd get it just perfect, and you'd know every step and timing down to the last detail. Well, we took a different approach. We approached it in an agile way. And we did a little bit of mock migrations, but basically we said, hey, we're going to try it, and if we have problems, we'll just roll it back, because it's non-destructive. We weren't tearing up our old platform, and worst case, we've had a little bit of business outage, and then we'll try again. So once and done was the approach. So why did we choose Azure to put it on? Some of the data centers of our hosting providers, they evicted us in essence because they were closing them for their own business, and everybody had to get out. We had a prior positive experience in Azure. We moved one of our problem applications, not an SAP but something else. There had been giving us a lot of grief. We were able to put it into Azure, and it ran very successfully. Microsoft's strong position in the cloud environment as well as our own internal skill set. We were a Microsoft shop, so it just made sense to do it. Some people will say, why aren't you doing a multiple platform, multiple cloud approach? We chose just one. We don't have enough staff to become really good and experts at multiple cloud platforms, so we decided to focus on one so we could do it well and do it right. So we needed help to move. So we'd been outsourced for the previous 6 years, and we had a brain drain. We didn't have anybody, we didn't have enough staff to accomplish it, right? I mean, that's one of the, when you outsource your stuff, I mean, it's kind of tough to get it back, and so we needed help. We had an inflexible timeline. They were, our hosting provider were closing the data centers on very fixed timelines, and there wasn't any begging to get them to extend, right? So we had to do it. We had to do it fast, and as well as just the volume of work, the number of servers and systems that had to be moved. So, so we brought in Khoj Information Technology to help us, and I'm going to hand it over to Jay and let him tell about all of it.
Thanks, Lauren. I appreciate that. So, Khoj has been, in the business of, SAP and more recently Azure Cloud over the last 5 years, doing a lot of successful implementations of SAP, both greenfields as well as migration to Azure. Done it for a number of Fortune 500 companies, both from our onshore location as well as offshore locations. And we're lucky to have Lauren here talk about the migration for DFA.
So there's different ways you could do it. In the old days, it was lift and shift, right? You put it on a truck and you suddenly became very spiritual and you prayed that it would come back when you got there. And a lot of times it wouldn't, right? It was, the disk just couldn't handle it. So then the next step, you could, then you use various media, right? You put it on a disk drive, thumb drives, tapes, right? And you had a lot of problems with that. And again, you hope that it would make it. But, again, that was slow. So you took efforts to make it faster. So I was involved in a data center migration, and we took a set of backup tapes, put it on a plane, and flew it across the country to the new data center. So this was a previous experience. I'm showing this one on the ground because we had 2 planes in case there was any problems with the backup tapes, which we know are unreliable, right? So we had a second plane chartered to take a second backup set. Well, it never made it off the tarmac. It got hung up with mechanical problems in Oklahoma, so still didn't work, right? So then, right, the wire, right, now we're getting really fancy and sophisticated. We'll run it across a very fast bandwidth. Even so, it still takes too long for many migrations, right, to just do it. You take your outage, you start copying it, and you go again. So then we had to get really fancy. And then that's where Jay and his team came in with some really innovative methods to get us there. So here you go.
All right. Thanks, Lauren. So essentially the methodology and the approach which we use for DFA is Microsoft's ASR, Azure Site Recovery Technology. It has the capability of using your express route bandwidth as well as your internet bandwidth to essentially migrate data over the wire real time. And you can start the process weeks in ahead of your migration or your cutover window. And it worked for us very well. Obviously there's some growing pains with any new technology. And the beauty of ASR is that we used it at DFA not only for the migration purposes, but we also used it for the disaster recovery purposes. Same technology used both for disaster recovery as well as for migration purposes. It has a capability of having a process server, a configuration server, and a mobility service which is installed on all the source machines, which have to be migrated to Azure. And it significantly reduces, as we'll talk later on, it significantly reduces your downtime window when you really have to do the migration itself during a weekend. And we were able to cut it short and meet all the business requirements in terms of getting some of the core ECC and BW systems onto Azure. The scope of the products, which were migrated, included ECC, the core ERP system, which DFA uses, the corresponding data warehousing system, a BW system, business objects, process integration, and then Solution Manager, Adobe Document Services, Web Dispatcher, and Enterprise Portal. And we use the same approach of starting with the dev landscape first, then moving to quality assurance, moving to production, and now while we are in Azure, we are starting to do system copies to create the sandbox systems and the production support systems directly in Azure, because it's relatively simple. Storage allocation is simple, networking is simple, standing up compute is simple to make those system copies and deliver to Lauren and his team relatively quickly, which was very difficult to do in the past. And this is the scope of the SAP products. Correspondingly, there are a number of other bolt-on or third-party products which were in scope as well, and challenging, right? Because as Lauren would talk about subsequently, the whole milk manifest process revolves around open text, which is very key, and was one of the most challenging systems for us to migrate because of the amount of data involved there. And then number of websites, the EDI system for B2B, WriteFax for faxing capabilities, Taulia's POD, co-fax systems, Active Batch for batch scheduling, and then the DMZ components, load balancers, etc. They were all migrated to Azure, or refactored in Azure in itself because there were better capabilities in Azure, like for load balancers, so on and so forth. This is a high-level architectural schematic, right? And I'm not going to spend too much time here, but it kind of shows how we moved from the left-hand side, which is the primary data center. That's where the ASR management server is running, and that's where the source machines are there, over to Azure on the right-hand side. And we use, the Azure Central US data center for the actual productive workload, and the East US for the disaster recovery workload. And we did migrate over the internet, consuming the bandwidth on the internet, which gave us the flexibility to ramp up, ramp down, without affecting the site-to-site traffic patterns on ExpressRoute. We took a move group approach, which is very common in such scenarios, wherein certain related applications are moved together. We used ASR as the key migration technology, and as Lauren had mentioned, we did some mock validations, but we used the approach, since we are not touching anything on the source side, and that's the beauty of ASR, is that you could try it, and if it does not work, it becomes your mock. If it works, it's your productive migration, right? So it's very elegant from that perspective. And in fact, I would give credit for that approach to Lauren, to DFA, right? That was not a standard approach which Khoj used to follow, right? But I think DFA brought it to the table, right? And we had Microsoft kind of approve it as well. Recommended migration groups in order, right? I think, we started with the SAP systems first, the core SAP systems, moving on to, the tier 2 SAP systems, which were supporting, and then the bolt-on products after that. There was some variation. This was the original plan. There was some variation based upon the business needs and requirements from a timeline perspective, but primarily, all the systems went on time. The only system where we had to use the third bullet point, was the Sterling B2B system, where we had to make 2 attempts. Primarily.
Yeah. So a couple comments on that. So the main challenge that we had in this was not the migration technology itself. It wasn't that things in Azure didn't work. It was our network connectivity, and we found out various surprises along the way. We did a migration of our open text capture center migration services, and it worked great the first day. And then the second day, there was all kinds of performance issues in our Northeast council area. And so we got to investigating very quickly with the Microsoft Cloud dashboard. We were able to see that we didn't have a server problem. We looked further, and there was somebody was transferring a massive 20 gig file and hogging up all the bandwidth for that, and it was necessary business traffic, but it outcompeted the transactional processing, and we realized that we just missed the quality of service settings for that region. So we had to fix that, and with EDI, as we were still having our point of presence going through our hosted provider, the routing was very complex, going through some different data centers and so on. And we found out way into the migration weekend for our EDI that our hosting provider blocked the kind of traffic that we needed to flow, and that they had change controls, and it was a big bunch of process, very time consuming to get it. So we had to abandon and try again another day, which we did, and have been running successfully for several weeks now.
All right, so this is essentially the technical validation, right, which we did, where we did the mock environments, how was the technical validation done, and we used an approach which is relatively easy in a cloud environment like Azure, is to stand up what's called an isolated validation environment. You still maintain the same host names, same IP addresses, do not change any of that, but kind of create a bubble. And within that bubble, you can do your validation, and you don't have to worry about number of different things in terms of integration, and you do not have to worry about two servers with the same host names, with the same IP addresses, so on and so forth. In fact, it's the same approach which is used even for the DR purposes, for doing a DR test as well, is that you can create an ISO network, an isolated network, and very easily get your testing done without exposing your disaster recovery while you're doing your testing. That means you're still protected while you're testing your DR environment or doing a migration at the same time. I'll skip through some of this. I think this is the timeline. In fact, Lauren, I would like you to talk about this because you very painfully put this together, and it's very important to kind of realize the timeline impacts.
Yeah, so very quickly, choosing a timeline was quite a challenge. So nobody wants to take an outage, and we went through multiple sequential dates that got vetoed. And finally, I took a different approach. Instead of saying, let's find a good weekend to do it, I said, let's find the least bad. And that was what really kind of broke the dam, and then we were able to arrive at some dates. We had projected outage windows that we would experience, and it was interesting, and we did not update the times as we went through, because it's like when you make a drive across country, there's some parts of the journey that run a little bit faster than scheduled, and then sometimes you hit traffic or road construction or whatever. And usually right out of the gate, we would gain a whole bunch of time, and then we would burn it up a little bit later on in the process as we sorted out some of the network connectivity and routing issues that that we ran into. So that was it. The last one is Right Facts, which that one's going this week.
Yeah, thanks, Lauren. And just to add to what Lauren mentioned, this 15 hours for the core ECC system included 10 plus application servers and end-to-end, including business validation, done in a 15-hour window. With actually time to spare, right, and resolve some of the issues after the validation as well. Some of the lessons learned, obviously, you want to use a move group approach. You don't want to migrate everything on a single weekend, very high risk, right? Sizing decisions on Azure, is that, you start with sizing up front so that you know that your first couple of weeks are handled well. It's relatively easy to scale up or scale down or scale out in Azure, and we were able to manage that. With any migration of this kind, connectivity of the systems is very important, right? So, and most of the customers and partners take care of that up front. Also, to stay away from any transformation work outside of lift and shift, right? You want to not commingle any other desire to do transformation or any other upgrades or patching along with it. We did some of it, but we significantly minimized it to make sure that there's no additional risk added to it. License keys, very important because you're moving to Azure, different hardware. So getting all of those license keys ahead of time. Very well created and very sophisticated and complex cutover plans with the app level of detail. Lauren made sure that both the DFA and the Khoj team put together plans which were reasonable, were accurate, and we could just go step by step during the cutover window to make it happen. And I think dependence on external vendors, especially for bolt-on products, is very important. We had full support from Azure, from SAP, from Microsoft, and any of the other third-party vendors, during the cutover weekends. We didn't have to use much of it, but the support was there.
Okay, real quick, business value, right? So everything that we do has to make sense around the kitchen table at the farm, right? So practicality is very important, and it was very easy to make the case, right? So yes, there was an investment, 1.6 million, where we're saving $2.5 million a year, right? So that's something that makes sense around anybody's kitchen table. So after that, it was very easy to get through it. Our monthly downtime at our hosted provider was it was 12 hours, right, for them to get through all the Microsoft patching and updates, and that was just brutal to the business. The other things, the cyber threats, right? So when Spectre and Meltdown came out, Microsoft and a few other major providers were already protected. They were still figuring it out. Our hosting provider was going to take months of patching because so many things had not been maintained in the microcode and all that. It was just unworkable. And I said, freeze the environments. We're leaving, right, as fast as we can. Don't touch it. We're able to, access to new technologies. In one meeting, in a two-minute period, we discussed data lake, blockchain, and APIs. All together, so just some really amazing things that we're able to do. We transformed our IT organization from managing contracts to doing real work that adds value, right? So nobody can do it as quickly and as responsibly as your own people, and that's what we found. And that's probably enough. Hey, and that's it. All right. Thanks, everybody. Questions? I think our time may be. Yes? Pardon? Yeah, database, Microsoft SQL Server. So 2008, we had a few that were 2012. So that's one of our transformations now. Now that we're into the cloud, we're going to go through and update everything and modernize it. All right, we'll be off to the side for a little while. So thanks, everybody.
Thank you.